A few years ago, my life was quite ordinary. I worked a 9-to-5 job in a small town where nothing much ever happened. But every year, Halloween was a big deal. The entire town would transform into a spooky wonderland with decorations on every house and children running around in costumes. It was a night of fun and harmless scares, or so I thought. That particular Halloween, I had attended a party at a friend's house. It was a lively event with laughter, music, and the usual Halloween pranks. As the night wore on, I decided to leave early to avoid the late-night rush. My house was on the other side of town, and the quickest way home was through an old, abandoned field of corn. It was a shortcut I had taken many times before without any incident. The field was vast and eerie, especially under the pale light of the full moon. The tall stalks of corn swayed gently in the breeze, creating a rustling sound that seemed to whisper secrets. The air was crisp, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the field. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was just another Halloween night, after all. I walked briskly, eager to get home. The path was familiar, but that night, something felt off. As I ventured deeper into the field, I noticed a scarecrow standing tall among the corn. It was dressed in tattered clothes, with a burlap sack for a head and eyes made of buttons. There was something unnervingly lifelike about it, but I shrugged it off and continued walking. The scarecrow stood in stark contrast to the otherwise desolate field. Its presence was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. As I walked past, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I quickened my pace, but the sensation only intensified. It was as if the scarecrow's button eyes were following my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The rustling of the corn seemed to grow louder, almost as if it were whispering warnings. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing, just the endless rows of corn and the eerie, silent scarecrow. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the rustling corn, but they grew louder, more distinct, and they were coming from behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, but again, there was nothing there. The scarecrow, however, was no longer in its original position. It had moved. Panic set in as I realized the scarecrow was no longer just a lifeless figure. It was following me. I broke into a run, my footsteps pounding against the hard ground. The sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, matching my pace. No matter how fast I ran, they were always right behind me. I glanced back once more, and to my horror, the scarecrow was closer than ever. Its button eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight, and its tattered clothes flapped in the wind as it moved. I stumbled and fell, the cold, hard ground knocking the wind out of me. As I struggled to get up, I felt a cold, bony hand grasp my ankle. The scarecrow was right there, its face inches from mine. It leaned in closer, and I could hear its ragged breathing. It whispered something I couldn't understand, but the malice in its voice was clear. I kicked and screamed, desperate to escape its grasp. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to kick free from the scarecrow's grasp. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted through the cornfield, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows that danced around me, making it difficult to see where I was going. The footsteps behind me were relentless, echoing my every move. I could feel my panic rising with each step. The scarecrow, once a mere decoration, was now a living nightmare. I glanced back and saw it again, closer than before. Its button eyes fixed on me with an unnatural intensity. The corn stalks seemed to close in around me, creating a maze that I couldn't escape. Desperation took over as I pushed myself to run faster. My mind raced with thoughts of how to get away, but every turn I took seemed to lead me deeper into the field. The scarecrow's presence was suffocating, and the sound of its footsteps was like a drumbeat of doom. I stumbled again, my foot catching on a hidden root. As I fell, I twisted my ankle, a sharp pain shooting up my leg. I cried out in agony, but there was no one to hear me. The scarecrow was upon me in an instant, its cold hands reaching for me once more. I could see its grotesque face clearly now, the burlap sack twisted into a sinister grin. "Why are you doing this?" I screamed, but the scarecrow's only response was a low, guttural laugh. It leaned in closer, its breath hot and foul against my skin. I could feel its grip tightening, and for a moment, I thought it was the end. The scarecrow's grip was like iron, and I could feel my strength waning. But then a surge of survival instinct kicked in. I twisted and thrashed, managing to land a solid kick to its face. The scarecrow recoiled, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet and limp away as fast as my injured ankle would allow. Every step was agony, but the fear of being caught again pushed me forward. The cornfield seemed endless, each row a mirror image of the last, disorienting me further. The scarecrow's laughter echoed through the night, a chilling reminder that it was still on my trail. I could hear its footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if it knew I had nowhere to go. My thoughts were a chaotic mix of fear and desperation. I needed to find a way out, but the field had become a labyrinth. The moonlight, which had once been a guide, now cast confusing shadows that played tricks on my mind. I stumbled upon a clearing, a small open space in the middle of the field. I took a moment to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, but the respite was short-lived. The scarecrow emerged from the corn, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. I backed away, my mind racing for a plan. There was an old, abandoned barn at the edge of the field, a place I had played in as a child. If I could reach it, maybe I could find something to defend myself, or at least a place to hide. With renewed determination, I turned and ran towards where I remembered the barn to be. The scarecrow followed, its pace unnervingly steady. My ankle throbbed with each step, but I forced myself to keep going. The barn came into view, its weathered wood and broken windows a welcome sight. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The interior was dark, filled with old farming equipment and bales of hay. I searched frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. My hands closed around a rusty pitchfork, and I positioned myself near the door, ready to defend myself. The scarecrow's footsteps grew louder, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it found me. I tightened my grip on the pitchfork, my heart racing. The door creaked open, and the scarecrow stepped inside, its eyes locking onto mine. This was it, the final confrontation. I stood there, clutching the pitchfork, my hands trembling. The scarecrow moved slowly towards me, its button eyes glinting in the dim light of the barn. I could hear its ragged breathing, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere left to go. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking. The scarecrow paused for a moment, as if considering my words, then continued its advance. I swung the pitchfork wildly, hoping to keep it at bay, but it easily sidestepped my desperate attack. It was now only a few feet away, and I could see the twisted grin on its burlap face. The scarecrow reached out with one of its cold, bony hands, and I swung the pitchfork again, this time connecting with its arm. The scarecrow let out a guttural howl, but it didn't stop. It grabbed the pitchfork and yanked it from my hands, tossing it aside like a toy. I stumbled back, tripping over a bale of hay and falling to the ground. The scarecrow loomed over me, its eyes burning with malice. It leaned in close, and I could feel its hot, foul breath on my face. "I shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a raspy hiss. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst, but then something unexpected happened. The scarecrow began to shake violently, its body convulsing as if it were being pulled apart from the inside. I opened my eyes just in time to see it collapse into a heap of straw and old clothes. I lay there, stunned and disbelieving. The scarecrow was gone, reduced to nothing more than a pile of rags. I struggled to my feet, my body aching from the ordeal. I didn't know what had caused the scarecrow to disintegrate, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I limped out of the barn, the night's events replaying in my mind like a nightmare. The field of corn was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for me. I forced myself to move, each step a painful reminder of my encounter with the scarecrow. When I finally reached the edge of the field, I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and in pain. The town was just a short distance away, but it felt like an insurmountable journey. I took a moment to catch my breath, my mind racing with questions. What had I just experienced? Was it real, or had my mind played tricks on me? I made my way back to town, avoiding the field of corn from then on. I told no one about what had happened, fearing they would think I was crazy, but the experience left a lasting mark on me. Every Halloween I was reminded of that night, the scarecrow's eyes, and the chilling whisper in the barn. I never took that shortcut again, and I always made sure to be home well before nightfall. The memory of the scarecrow haunted my dreams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. The fear stayed with me, a constant reminder that some legends are more than just stories. Years have passed, but the terror of that Halloween night remains fresh in my mind. I still avoid fields of corn and scarecrows, knowing that the line between reality and nightmare is thinner than we think. The scarecrow may be gone, but its presence lingers, a shadow that will follow me for the rest of my days. A few years ago, my life was fairly routine. I worked a regular job in a quiet town where nothing much ever happened. Halloween, however, was always an exception. The town would come alive with decorations, and parties would spring up in every neighborhood. It was during one such Halloween season that I received an unusual invitation. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Inside was a beautifully crafted card, inviting me to a Halloween party at an old mansion on the outskirts of town. There was no signature, just the promise of an unforgettable night. My curiosity was piqued. Who could have sent this? And why to me? Despite the mystery, or perhaps because of it, I decided to go. The idea of a night filled with excitement and a touch of the unknown was too tempting to resist. Little did I know, this decision would lead me into an experience that would haunt me forever. The night of the party, I drove to the mansion. The road was dark and winding, with only the occasional street light to guide me. When I finally arrived, the mansion stood tall and imposing against the night sky, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. Yet there were no other cars in sight, no sign of other guests. I parked my car and walked up to the grand entrance. The heavy wooden door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing an interior that was both lavishly decorated and eerily silent. The air inside was cool, and a faint scent of old wood and candle wax filled my nostrils. Stepping into the foyer, I was struck by the impeccable decorations. Cobwebs draped artfully over chandeliers, and carved pumpkins lined the hallways. It was clear that a lot of effort had gone into setting the perfect Halloween atmosphere. But despite the festive decor, there was an underlying sense of unease that I couldn't shake. As I ventured further into the mansion, the silence became more pronounced. I called out a tentative hello but received no response. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and I began to wonder if I was the only one there. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a faint murmur of voices coming from a room down the hall. Following the sound, I entered a grand ballroom. There, I found a group of people, all wearing elaborate masks. They greeted me warmly, but there was something unsettling in their eyes, something that made me feel like an outsider. The masks were beautifully crafted, each one unique, but they hid the true expressions of the wearers, adding to my discomfort. The party had begun, but the atmosphere was far from what I had expected. As the night progressed, the sense of unease only grew stronger. Despite my initial discomfort, I tried to mingle with the masked guests. The ballroom was filled with laughter and conversation, but there was an odd detachment to it all. The masks made it difficult to read expressions, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was hiding something. I approached a small group gathered near a grand fireplace. They welcomed me with polite nods, their eyes glinting behind their masks. "Enjoying the party," one of them asked, their voice muffled and indistinct. "It's interesting," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Who organized all this?" The question seemed to hang in the air for a moment before another guest answered. "The host prefers to remain anonymous. Adds to the mystery, don't you think?" I nodded, but their vague responses only heightened my unease. As I moved through the room, I noticed that the guests were gradually disappearing. One moment they were there, and the next, they were gone. The lights began to flicker intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I decided to explore further, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. Every room I entered seemed to lead me back to the ballroom, as if the mansion itself was playing tricks on me. The sense of being trapped grew stronger with each step. As more guests vanished, my anxiety turned to fear. I wandered through the mansion, searching for an exit or someone who could help. The hallways seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways, leading me in circles. Each door I opened revealed another empty room, decorated with the same meticulous care as the ballroom. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was as if the mansion had a mind of its own. Every attempt to leave brought me back to the same place. The flickering lights and the oppressive silence only added to the sense of dread that was building inside me. In a desperate bid to find a way out, I stumbled upon a narrow staircase leading to the upper floors. The steps creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder as I ascended. At the top, I found a long corridor lined with closed doors. I hesitated, then chose one at random and pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The only light came from a small window at the far end. I crossed the room and peered out, hoping to see some sign of the outside world. Instead, I saw my own reflection staring back at me from a cracked mirror. As I turned to leave, I noticed a faint glow coming from beneath a door at the end of the corridor. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was locked, but I could hear faint whispers on the other side. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I forced the door open. The room beyond was unlike any other I had seen in the mansion. It was filled with old photographs, each one depicting a Halloween party much like the one I was attending. The guests in the photos wore the same elaborate masks, but there was something different about their expressions. In each picture, one of the guests looked terrified, as if they knew something the others didn't. My eyes were drawn to a photograph in the center of the room. It showed a group of people standing in the very ballroom I had just left. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized myself among them, my face twisted in an expression of sheer panic. I stood there, frozen, staring at the photograph of myself. How was this possible? I had no memory of posing for this picture. Yet there I was, surrounded by masked strangers, my face a mask of terror. The room seemed to close in around me, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I began to examine the other photographs more closely. Each one depicted a different Halloween party, but the setting and the masks were always the same. The guests changed, but there was always one person in each photo who looked as frightened as I did. It was as if the mansion had a history of these eerie gatherings, and each one ended in the same way. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around slowly, sensing that I was no longer alone. A cold, bony hand rested on my shoulder, and I spun around to see one of the masked guests standing behind me. The mask they wore was an intricate design of silver and black, hiding their features completely. Without a word, the masked figure handed me another photograph. My hands trembled as I took it and looked down. It was a picture of me, taken just moments ago, in this very room. My expression was one of pure horror, mirroring the faces in the other photographs. Before I could react, the room began to spin and everything went dark. I awoke outside the mansion, lying on the cold, damp ground. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat up slowly, my head pounding and my body aching. The mansion loomed behind me, silent and foreboding. I had no memory of how I had gotten there, but the events of the night before were vivid in my mind. The masked guests, the disappearing partygoers, the photographs. All of it felt like a twisted nightmare. But the dirt on my clothes and the lingering fear told me it had been all too real. I stumbled to my feet and made my way back to my car, which was parked exactly where I had left it. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with questions. Who had sent the invitation? What was the purpose of the party? And most importantly, why had I been chosen? In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, but the memories haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the terrified faces in the photographs, and I felt the cold hand on my shoulder. I avoided Halloween parties and any invitations that came without a clear sender. The mansion still stands on the outskirts of town, and sometimes I drive past it, feeling its gaze follow me. The sense of being watched has never left me, and I can't shake the feeling that the mansion is waiting, biding its time until the next Halloween. The experience left a scar on my soul, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Years have passed, but the fear remains. I know now that curiosity can lead to dark places, and some invitations are best left unanswered. As time went on, I tried to return to my normal life, but the memory of that Halloween night never truly faded. Every October, as the decorations went up and the air grew crisp, I felt a familiar dread creeping in. The mere sight of a Halloween mask was enough to send shivers down my spine. A few years ago, my life was fairly routine. I lived in a small town where nothing much ever happened, but Halloween was always an exception. The entire town would come alive with decorations, and people would go all out with their costumes. It was the one night of the year when everyone could let loose and have fun. That particular Halloween, I decided to dress up as a vampire. I spent the afternoon preparing my costume, making sure every detail was perfect. As evening approached, I could feel the excitement building. The streets were already filling with people in various costumes, and the air was filled with laughter and the distant sound of music. I had been invited to a party at a friend's house, but before heading there, I decided to take a stroll through the town to soak in the festive atmosphere. The decorations were impressive, with carved pumpkins, fake cobwebs, and eerie lights adorning every house. It was a perfect Halloween night, or so I thought. As I walked through the crowded streets, I noticed a man standing alone near the edge of the town square. He was dressed in a tattered costume, holding a chainsaw in his hand. At first, I thought it was just a very elaborate and realistic costume. The chainsaw looked old and rusty, and his clothes were stained with what looked like fake blood. I chuckled to myself, impressed by the effort he had put into his costume. However, as I continued to observe him, I felt a strange sense of unease. There was something off about the way he stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on the crowd. It was as if he was searching for someone. I decided to move on, but as I turned to leave, I realized he was following me. My heart began to race, and I tried to reassure myself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was heading in the same direction. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose him in the crowd, but he matched my speed, his eyes never leaving me. Panic began to set in. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him closing the distance between us. The sound of the chainsaw, which I had initially thought was a prop, now seemed menacingly real. I knew I had to get away, but the streets were too crowded. I needed to find a place to hide. Without thinking, I darted down a side street, hoping to shake him off. The narrow alley was dark and empty, and I could hear the faint hum of the chainsaw growing louder. I had to find a safe place, and fast. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the dark alley. The sound of the chainsaw was getting closer, and I knew I had to find a place to hide. I turned a corner and saw a small park with a thick line of trees at the far end. It wasn't much, but it was my best chance to lose him. I dashed into the park, the shadows of the trees providing some cover. The leaves crunched under my feet as I ran deeper into the small forested area. I could hear the chainsaw roaring behind me, and every instinct screamed at me to keep moving. As I ran, I tried to come up with a plan. The park was small, and there weren't many places to hide. I needed to find a spot where I could catch my breath and figure out my next move. I spotted a large fallen tree and decided to take cover behind it. I crouched down, trying to control my breathing and make as little noise as possible. The sound of the chainsaw grew louder, and I could hear the man's heavy of the town. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and began to crawl away from my hiding spot. Every movement felt agonizingly slow, but I knew I couldn't afford to make any noise. As I crept through the underbrush, the forest seemed to close in around me. The branches clawed at my costume, and the darkness made it difficult to see. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of the chainsaw. The silence was almost worse than the noise, leaving me to wonder where he might be. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the forest. I could see the lights of the town in the distance, a beacon of safety. Summoning all my courage, I stood up and began to run. My legs protested with every step, but the fear of being caught pushed me forward. I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a quiet residential street. The houses were dark, and the only sound was the distant hum of the Halloween festivities. I glanced back, half expecting to see the man with the chainsaw emerging from the forest, but there was no sign of him. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it and every other door and window in the house. My chest heaved with exertion and fear as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The silence of my home was a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. I sank to the floor, my mind racing with the events of the night. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, I had been excited about Halloween. Now, all I could think about was the man with the chainsaw and how close I had come to being caught. The man's eyes, cold and relentless, as he hunted me through the forest. The sound of the chainsaw still echoed in my ears, a haunting reminder of how close I had come to danger. I knew I couldn't stay there on the floor forever, but my body felt heavy with exhaustion and fear. Slowly, I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where I poured myself a glass of water. My hands were still trembling, and I had to steady myself against the counter. As I sipped the water, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Why had he targeted me? Was it random, or had he been watching me all along? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. All I knew was that I had to be more cautious from now on. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows one more time before heading to my bedroom. I didn't bother changing out of my costume. I was too drained to care. I collapsed onto the bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The house was eerily quiet, and every creak and groan of the old wood made me jump. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face and heard the roar of the chainsaw. I kept the light on, hoping it would keep the nightmares at bay. It was a long, restless night, and I was grateful when the first light of dawn finally filtered through the curtains. The next morning, the events of the previous night felt like a distant nightmare, but the soreness in my muscles and the scratches on my arms were a stark reminder that it had been all too real. I took a long shower, hoping to wash away the fear and tension that still clung to me. As I dressed, I couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see the man with the chainsaw standing there. But the street was quiet and empty, and I tried to reassure myself that the danger had passed. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The town was slowly waking up, and the remnants of the Halloween festivities were scattered everywhere. I passed by the park where I had first noticed the man, and a shiver ran down my spine. Despite the fear that still lingered, I knew I couldn't let this experience control my life. Halloween had always been my favorite holiday, and I didn't want it to be tainted by one night of terror. I resolved to be more cautious in the future, but I wouldn't let fear keep me from enjoying the things I loved. As I walked back home, I felt a sense of determination. The memory of that night would always be with me, but it wouldn't define me. I had faced a real-life horror and survived, and while I would always be more vigilant, I wouldn't let fear dictate my actions. Years have passed since that Halloween night, and while the memory still sends a chill down my spine, I continue to celebrate the holiday with friends and family. It's a reminder that, even in the face of fear, we can find strength and resilience within ourselves. As time went on, I tried to return to my normal life, but the memory of that Halloween night never truly faded. Every October, as the decorations went up and the air grew crisp, I felt a familiar dread creeping in. The mere sight of a Halloween mask was enough to send shivers down my spine. A few years ago, my life was fairly routine. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. Halloween, however, was always an exception. The entire town would come alive with decorations, and children would roam the streets in their costumes, shouting trick or treat at every door. That particular Halloween, I decided to stay home and hand out candy to the neighborhood kids. I spent the afternoon decorating the front yard with carved pumpkins, fake cobwebs, and eerie lights. By evening, everything was ready, and I settled in with a bowl of candy, waiting for the first trick-or-treaters to arrive. The night started off as usual, with a steady stream of children coming to the door. Their laughter and excitement filled the air, and I enjoyed seeing their creative costumes. As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin, and the streets grew quieter. I was about to call it a night when the doorbell rang one last time. It was around midnight when I heard the doorbell ring again. I assumed it was just a late trick-or-treater, so I grabbed the bowl of candy and opened the door. Standing there was a man, tall and imposing, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. His face was completely hidden behind a mask that covered his entire head. He didn't say a word, just stood there silently, extending his hand as if expecting candy. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease. The mask was unnerving, and his silence made it even more disturbing. Nevertheless, I dropped a few pieces of candy into his outstretched hand. Instead of leaving, the man remained standing on my porch, staring at me through the mask. The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. I tried to make small talk, asking him about his costume, but he didn't respond. His silence was oppressive, and I could feel my heart begin to race. I decided to close the door, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But as I shut the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After closing the door, I tried to return to my usual routine, but the unsettling encounter with the masked man lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I peered through the window and saw him still standing there, motionless, staring at my house. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was waiting for friends or just playing a prank, but the longer he stood there, the more my anxiety grew. I decided to ignore him, hoping he would eventually leave. Minutes passed, and the doorbell rang again. My heart pounded as I approached the door. I opened it slightly, just enough to see him still standing there, his hand extended once more. This time, I didn't open the door fully. Instead, I asked him to leave, my voice trembling. He didn't move or respond. The silence was deafening, and the tension was unbearable. I closed the door again, locking it this time. I turned off the porch light, hoping it would deter him. But even in the darkness, I could feel his presence. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant ringing of the doorbell and the oppressive feeling of being watched were driving me to the edge. I decided to confront him and put an end to this bizarre situation. Gathering all my courage, I flung the door open and demanded to know what he wanted. The man remained silent, his masked face giving nothing away. Instead of speaking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to me without a word, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, stunned and confused, watching him vanish into the night. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It was an old, faded picture of my house, taken many years ago. In the photo, a shadowy figure stood at one of the windows, staring out. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the figure in the photo was standing in the same spot where I had seen the masked man. The implications were terrifying, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I stared at the photograph, my mind racing with questions. Who was the man in the mask? How did he have this old photo of my house? And why did he give it to me? The shadowy figure in the window looked eerily familiar, but I couldn't place it. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a prank, but the fear gnawing at my gut told me otherwise. The photograph felt like a warning, a message that I couldn't decipher. I paced the living room, glancing nervously at the windows, half expecting to see the masked man staring back at me. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to search the house for any signs of intrusion. Room by room, I checked every corner, every closet, but found nothing unusual. Still, the unease persisted, and I couldn't ignore the sense that something was terribly wrong. I returned to the living room and examined the photograph again. The figure in the window seemed to be watching me, just as the masked man had done. I couldn't help but feel that the two were connected in some sinister way. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I was in danger. The rest of the night was a blur of restless pacing and constant checking of the locks. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, not with the memory of that masked man and the ominous photograph haunting my thoughts. As dawn approached, I finally decided to take action. I called a friend and explained what had happened. They were understandably skeptical, but agreed to come over and stay with me for a few days. Having someone else in the house helped ease my nerves, but the feeling of being watched never fully disappeared. Over the next few days, I took extra precautions. I installed security cameras around the house and made sure all the locks were secure. I even considered moving, but the thought of leaving my home because of some mysterious stranger felt like giving in to the fear. Halloween came and went, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the masked man was still out there, watching and waiting. I decided to avoid being alone on Halloween in the future, always making sure to have friends or family around. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.